Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning. Welcome to everyone and greetings from the city of Tuban, where I am currently. I'd like to thank also the Museum Kambang Putih for allowing me to use their space. Thank you for attending our Archaeology and Art History Series program, the AAHP, dedicated today to bronze sculpture and ceramics in Southeast Asia, which produced landmark artifacts, as we all know, for domestic use, as well as for objects of prestige and power in both continental and island Southeast Asia. So today we'll have a very special seminar with 3 speakers presenting from different cities. Dr. Heidi Tan will be presenting from London, Eko Bastiawan will be presenting from East Java, and Dr. Mathilde Mechling from Singapore. So because of this dense program, I will present our speakers without further delay. The first talk on bronze sculpture and ceramics will be introduced by Eko Bastiawan and Mathilde Mechling. Eko is an independent researcher and an Alpha Wood alumnus. He completed a postgraduate diploma in Asian art and he has a master in history of art and archaeology from SOAS University in London. And being one of the rare young specialists in this language, in Old Javanese, he's currently involved in a program with the FAO on Old Javanese inscriptions. Now, Dr. Mathilde Mechling is also an independent researcher currently living in Singapore. She received recently her PhD from the Sorbonne University and Leiden Universities jointly. Her PhD addressed Hindu and Buddhist bronze statuary from the Indonesian archipelago, and she recently published an article on this topic for the BFAO. As a young expert in this domain, she's a member of the scientific committee of the casting project, which you can find on her on our THRC page. Mathilde and Eko will be presenting for 20 minutes each, followed by Dr. Heidi Tan, who will give a 30-minute presentation after this. So I will introduce Dr. Heidi Tan after Eko and Mathilde's talk. And this all will be followed by 20 minutes Q&A session. So do ask your questions early on, as we usually only answer the early ones. We usually do not have time for all the questions. So I'll introduce Dr. Heidi Tan in the second part of this seminar. So without further delay, please, Eko and Mathilde, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hélène, for this introduction, and I would like to thank you and Noel for inviting me for this lecture. And also thanks to Eko for accepting to present this lecture with me. So let me share my presentation. Yes. So, so today we're going to talk about bronze sculpture in Southeast Asia. So bronze was used to produce sculpture all over the world since the 4th millennium for Common Era. And so the most impressive bronze objects which are found in Southeast Asia are the Dongsong drums, which Noel introduced during the first lecture of the year. We focus on statues depicting gods of the Hindu and Buddhist religions. Buddhism and Hinduism are 2 religions which originate in India and introduced to Southeast Asia around the 4th, 5th century, as far as we can tell from archaeological remains and statuary and inscriptions. It seems that metal statues in Southeast Asia started to be made around the 6th century. So during this lecture, I will not be able to explore in details all the specific bronze casting tradition of every region in Southeast Asia. I want to focus on the fact that these statues are not typical art objects. They are religious images, and this is going to be the guiding thread in this lecture to explore several broad of bronze images impacted their fabrication, how it also defined their use, and how this religious aspect also had a role in inter-regional exchanges between Southeast Asian regions, as well as with India and China. And in the second part of this lecture, my colleague Eko will introduce a specific group of Javanese metal images, so you will get an insight into a more specific production of Southeast Asia. So I'm going to start first with the fabrication of bronze statues. So we're going to see the material, the technique that was used, and then I'm going to talk about archaeometallurgy. So let's see what it is. So the term bronze designates an alloy that is a blend of several metals, and the main metals of a bronze alloy are copper and tin. And in addition to these main metals, there are other metals in smaller quantities. And Southeast Asia possesses one of the largest tin deposits in the world. It extends from South Myanmar to the Thai Malay Peninsula, all the way down to islands that are off the coast of Sumatra, such as Bangka Island here. So Southeast Asia clearly benefited from this direct access to tin, as we can see from a large production of bronze statuary in the region. So I'm going to talk a bit about the manufacturing process of bronze statues. One of the most common is called the lost wax casting technique. And it combines the technique of modeling wax and clay, as well as metallurgy. So the first step in the process of making a bronze statue is actually to model a wax model. So the statue, and sometimes there is a clay core inside this wax model. This wax model is then covered with clay to form a mold, and this mold is baked. And when during the baking process, the wax becomes liquid and just melts out of the mold. And instead, in the space that is left by the wax, the liquid metal is put in to obtain the finished statue. There are examples. So although we lack written sources to know precisely the casting techniques that were used during the pre-modern period, making bronze statues is still a living tradition. For instance, in Myanmar, in Cambodia. So this can help us to understand how ancient statues were made. And here you see some examples. First of a model being made in wax. Then the second step is to make this mold of clay around the wax model. And then the last image shows the process after the mold has been broken. Then the statue in metal, in bronze, is ready, and it has to be cleaned from the remains of clay of the mold around it. So besides these living traditions that help us to document the manufacturing process, we can also use techniques that derive from archaeometallurgy. So archaeometallurgy is a sub-discipline of archaeology, and it examines all aspects of the production and use of metals, including the manufacturing of bronze statues. And these technical studies of bronze statues are crucial to know more about the artisans and culture who produced them. So it is possible to conduct visual examinations to identify casting fixtures that remain on the bronzes, but quite often we also need to use technical examination that require laboratory equipment. One of these, for example, is X-ray radiography, and you have an image here on the right to show you what an X-ray radiography looks like. So we can see how if a bronze image is solid cast or hollow cast, all kind of details. One aspect I would like to draw attention today is the fact that bronze statues today have a greenish color on their surface, or sometimes a bit black. And but this is not the original color of these images. When you sample the metal at the core of a bronze image, the color varies from yellow to pink. And so that's an example of the metal that has been sampled here at the bottom. So after casting and cleaning a bronze statues, the color is very similar to gold. And you can imagine the visual impact of these bronze images, which were religious images. So the visual impact really complemented the function as religious objects. So this introduces the next theme I want to explore in this presentation, which is the making of large bronze statues, which have been found in Southeast Asia and were most likely the main cultic images in temples. So I'm going to show you an example from Cambodia, Java, and the Thai Malay Peninsula. So the first example from Cambodia is a large bronze statue of Vishnu. Today it's fragmentary, but the fragment itself today is 2 meters long, and originally the statue was 6 meters long. So it was a very large statue, and it had a very strong visual impact because the jewelry, so like the necklace, the bracelets were gilded, so were covered with a layer of gold, and the eyebrows, as well as the eyes and the mustache on the face were inlaid with other metals to create a coloration effect. And we know that this image was found, we know that this image was made in the Royal Foundry of Angkor Thom. It's a foundry that has recently been excavated. So we know that this image was a royal commission, and it was indeed found in a state temple. So it was found in the West Mebon temple, which is located in the center of the West Barai, which is a large water reservoir. So the statue was found in the 19th century, together with other fragments. And in its original states, the statue represented Vishnu sleeping on the serpent Ananta, which is a creation myth in Hindu cosmology. So the composition was quite similar to the stone lintel that I show here on this slide. And this bronze statue of Vishnu was originally placed in the center of the temple on a platform, and the monument itself was a reservoir in the middle of the West Barai, which is a reservoir. So the statue served to purify the water of this reservoir. I'm going to show you some examples from Java, which are not as impressive as the large Vishnu from Cambodia, but they are still around 1 meter high. And they were most probably also main images in temples. And we know from fragments of a bronze aircule, probably of a Buddha, found in Chandisewu. So we know from this fragment that more than life-size statuary probably existed in Java. So the main throne in the Chandisewu temple was most probably occupied by a Buddha image, a large Buddha image. And these are some examples from the Thai Malay Peninsula, which are also around 1 meter high. So besides these large bronze statues, most of the bronze statues found in Southeast Asia are actually small size images, which range in size between 5 to 50 centimeters. And for instance, for Indonesia alone, there are over 1,000 small images preserved today in museums. So it is to give you an idea of how large the production of bronze metal statue was. So we are going to explore different themes with these smaller images. First of all, I just want to give you an idea of the variety of style, iconography of these smaller images that are found in different regions. So these are examples from Thailand. Here you have some examples from Central Java. I'm not detailing the style because I don't have the time. Here are some an example on the left from Myanmar and examples from Thailand, as well as example from Cambodia. So the function of these smaller images was different from the larger images presented before. In general, they are interpreted as objects that were made for personal use and private devotion because of their small size. And in India, small metal images have been found in excavations in the cells of monks in Buddhist monasteries. And in the temples of Southeast Asia, they are, for example, in Chandisewu, which is the image here on the right, in central Java, there are niches in the walls, which suggests that metal images perhaps were donated to temples and were placed in the temples. And sometimes, as I'm showing here on the lower picture, metal images have been found together with ritual objects, such as bells and datras, which indicates that they were probably used on the same altar, and in that case, most probably in a temple village. So for these smaller images, we don't always know who the patrons who commissioned them were, but some of them bear donative inscription, and it appears that their making, like the making of any divine image, accrued the spiritual merits of the donors. One aspect of these images that is less commonly explored and which require still more research is the fact that they contained consecration deposits. So the consecration of an image is a ritual that is conducted after the casting of the image, and it enables to invite the deity to reside in the image. So as such, the image is no longer just an image, it becomes the deity. And this consecration ritual includes the insertion inside images of sacred objects. And today, bronze images sometimes have a cavity. This is an example from Central Java, where the cavity is located inside the pedestal and inside the body of the divine figure. Most of the time, these consecration deposits have been lost or removed. We don't know exactly why. Here are other examples to show you that in other regions, there are different types of cavity with different forms and located in different parts of the bronze statues. And some notable examples are known from Java, where the consecration deposits are still intact inside the images. So this is an example found of a Buddha statue found in Borneo, which contained a metal foil that was folded and inserted inside the lotus pedestal of the image. And this foil has been extracted and unfolded and read, and there is an inscription. There are several inscriptions on it, which are extracted from sacred Buddhist texts, and these texts were used to consecrate the image. Another example from Java, in that case, the consecration deposits have not been extracted, but using neutron tomography, which is a technique to see inside the image, we know that there's also a foil inside the pedestal and object that looks like coins. So to finish this presentation, I want to discuss the role of small bronze images in inter-regional exchange. Their small size and weight made them easily portable, and we know through the accounts of Chinese pilgrims who visited India that they brought back metal and wood images when they traveled back to China. And very often they traveled through the maritime part of Southeast Asia. So there's no written sources about the circulation of bronze image within Southeast Asia or between the region and India and China, but some Buddhist bronzes have been found in shipwrecks in the Java Sea. And they were found together with ritual objects such as vajras and bell, which suggests that they were the personal belongings of monks and nuns, probably returning home after a pilgrimage. Another way to know, to see that bronze images evidence interregional exchange is through an analysis of their style. So for instance, these 4 bronze Buddha found in Sulawesi, Java, Thailand, and Vietnam share a similar style that is most visible through their pleated monastic dress. And bronze statues with a similar pleated robe have been found on the island of Sri Lanka and in Amaravati in the south of India. So it suggests a relationship between these 2 regions and Southeast Asia. Now, if you go and read about bronze culture in Southeast Asia after this lecture, you will see that past studies have a tendency to see India as the artistic source for bronze statues in Southeast Asia, because India is where Buddhism and Hinduism originate. And for this group of Buddha in particular, which were found in Southeast Asia, it is assumed very often that they were imported from Amaravati in India. However, this image on the left, which was found in Amaravati, is the only one in this style found in India. There are other images found at the site, but they are in a different style. So now if you look at the distribution of these Buddha images with pleated robe throughout South and Southeast Asia, you see that there are many more examples found in Southeast Asia and in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, there are 13 images in total. So it makes us wonder why the Buddha image found at Amaravati could not have come from Southeast Asia or maybe from Sri Lanka. This is to draw attention to some uncertainties that we have in the field about the provenance of images. And there is a growing tendency in scholarship to see interrelationship as more dynamic and multidirectional than in the past, because there were multiple agents traveling in the region, such as traders, pilgrims, and artisans. And there is much more research needed on the regional exchanges between South and Southeast Asia, and also with China. To finish, I just want to show you other examples of interregional exchange, other examples of networks. These 2 images found in Thailand and Java are comparable to images found in the region that is today Southeast Bangladesh. So it suggests a network of relationship with this region. And these images exemplify connections between Sumatra and Japan through a bronze image and clay tablets. And beside these images that show connection with multiple regions, there are also production of small images in Southeast Asia, which are specific to the region. And I'm going to let Echo continue this lecture to present a group of images from Java, which are not found anywhere else. Echo, you can continue.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So thank you very much, Mathilde, for taking us through the journey of the ancient bronze traditions and productions, and also their network to the Indian subcontinents, to Sri Lanka, to India, even to Tokyo. And as for my part, instead of showing sort of the whole chronology of the history of the Javanese bronzes, which obviously requires more time, and the time will not allow me to do that here. And there are so many types of Javanese bronzes. Sometimes they are, in terms of the periodization, they are overlapping each other, which makes it difficult. So I thought it would be more meaningful to just focus on, or just pick one specific type of bronze, one group of bronze, which happens also to be one of the most significant discovery, I think, in the whole history of the Javanese bronzes. And that is the Nganjuk bronzes, the group of bronzes that you are seeing now on the screen. These bronzes are remarkable in terms of their stylistic features, as well as their religious backgrounds. And also there is a reason why I choose this group, because as far as I'm concerned, that this group is still relatively understudied, and they come in large numbers, and they are now in many museums, not just in Indonesia, but also in museums in Europe and also in America. So I do really hope that by the end of today's sessions, some of you would be interested in doing more research and hopefully shed more light on these groups, on the specific groups. So I will start by sharing briefly the discovery of this group. This is the map of Java Island, just in case some of you are not familiar with the islands, but I'm sure that all of you know where the Java Island is. So the bronzes were discovered in Candirejo village, in Desa Candirejo, in Nganjuk, in East Java. And in the same village, nowadays one can still see the ruin of a candilor. What we can see now is just the foundations of the temples of a candilor. And not just of the temples, in the same place, there was also a stone inscriptions issued by King Sindo in 859 Saka. The inscription is now in the Museum National in Jakarta. Although there is not clear yet what is the relations between the bronzes and also this other findings, the candilor and also the stone inscription, if there are any. But I just wanted to point out that this area is very rich in the archaeological vestiges. The earlier reporting discovery of these bronzes was from the colonial reports in the 1913s. It was Krom who reported that two farmers in Nganjuk, in Candirejo, accidentally discovered large number of bronzes. I think it was around 99 bronzes, and the farmers sold them immediately to the private collectors, but the Dutch authorities managed to retrieve the biggest part of it, which now becomes the collections at the Museum National in Jakarta, and the gallery where these bronzes are displayed are currently under refurbishments. So I apologize for the bad quality of the pictures, but Krom noticed that the finding was really important. He even compared the discovery to the discovery of the Rosetta Stones, the infamous Rosetta Stones, saying that it was something big, something phenomenal, and he himself immediately tried to identify the objects and comes to the conclusions that these figurines would have been manufactured in these workshops, and they would have performed, they would have represent a mandala, a topic that I'm going to touch later. Some of the objects who were sold to the private collectors made their way to museums in America and also in Europe. 6 of them, so 4 are here, but 6, I think, in total are now part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There is 1 at the V&A in London. 2 figurines, the Vajraganda and also Vajraketu, are displayed. The last times I visited the museums, are displayed on the 2nd floor of the Tropen Museums in Amsterdam. And I had also the opportunity to visit another figurines which is in their storage, and it's really remarkable. So the processes are actually very, very tiny, but in terms of the productions, in terms of the details, they are very remarkable. Still in Amsterdam, there is 1 Vajrasattva figurine, and I came across this the last piece when I visited the museums in Trouwlands not so long time ago, and the label says that this is a Tara, and I think it's quite interesting also to address here that I think many museums would prefer to label the female Buddhist deity as a generic terms, as a Tara, while in fact, if we look closely at the attributes of the deity here, for example, so 3 drums in front of her, we can actually give sort of more precise identifications. Here we are dealing with the deity of Muraja. Dating the bronzes in general has always been a very challenging task. So far in the history of the Indonesian bronze, I think there is only one bronze, a triad of Avalokiteswara, discovered in Palembang, I think. But Mathilde, please correct me if I'm wrong. So this bronze bears an inscription. It has the date of 961 Saka, and I think that's the only dated bronze that so far has ever discovered in Indonesia. So how to establish the dates, to set the dates of these bronzes? One may use the stylistic feature of the bronzes. The material testings also sometimes useful to help establish, to locate the bronzes on a certain period of times. And in the case of the Nganjuk groups, the specific type of mandala represented could also shed some light on the dates. So the main image of the Nganjuk bronzes is the 4-face Vairocana, or known as the Mahavairocana. And if we look closely at the backrest of this image, it's just under the sort of bent parasol, which is very typical of the Javanese bronze, we observe a figure of Kala here. But we see that this Kala doesn't have the lower jaw, which is very typical of the Central Javanese Kala, as also seen here, as also demonstrated as Central Javanese type Kala from Asmolean museums. However, we also notice that this Kala, this figure of Kala, started to have the horns, some things that becomes more prominent during the East Javanese type of Kala. So one could perhaps think that perhaps we are dealing with the productions of bronzes during the sort of the transitional period in terms of the art from the Central to East Javanese, because we have a combinations of the Kala without the lower jaw and then Kala with the horns. A further comparisons with the inscriptions that earlier I mentioned, discovered in Candilor, in the same side of the Candilor, dated to 859 Saka, which has the Kala engraved on it. Here we see that the Kala has started to look more like the East Javanese Kala rather than the Central Javanese Kala. Then one might also could say that these bronzes could have been manufactured as early as the 9th century, or the first half of the 9th century. I think the some bronzes which has similar styles in Mise-Kime, the material was tested. I think Mathilde was done some testings on the materials from the similar bronze and find out that the copper used are actually from Central Java. So he perhaps here's the groups were manufactured in Central Java during 9th century, as early as the 9th century or the first half of the 9th century, and then for some reasons they were transported to East Java or to Nganjuk. One of the I think striking feature of Nganjuk bronzes is their spiky ornamentations. Their sort of the spikiness is actually as a result of the heavy jewelry and ornamentations that each of these figures has. So each of the figurines at least has one necklace. Sometimes they have 2 necklaces, and they have these 3 bracelets. The upper, the ones in the middle, the elbow is become very prominent from this period, from this group, and something that is very rare observed in the Central Javanese or in the earlier period. And the third bracelet is here at the wrist. The Udara Banda adorned both female and then male deities. Usually in the Central Javanese or in the earlier period, the Udara Banda is only observed on the male deities. And in addition, the color of the ribbons, the strands of hairs, the heavy ornamentations on the diadems sort of enhance the spikiness, the strikingness of this feature. And in contrast, we see here a figure of the Bodhisattva from Central Java, where the ornamentations are still rather not as elaborate as the ones from Nganjuk. It is also interesting to see the development of styles of the backrest. So as the early Central Javanese styles, the backrest sort of very simple, small, less decorated, less ornamented. But towards the end, here in our main figures of the Nganjuk bronzes, we have the Mahavarojana, which is very rich in ornamentations, and against the ornamentations of the backrest enhance the spikiness of the figures that has never observed before in the previous period. Another thing that I would like to also discuss is the fact that the many, not all, but many of the Nganjuk figurines, the Nganjuk bronzes, they sort of display the acrobatic postures of the dramatic pose. And here we see the elongated type of body, the awful face, the movement of the body, sort of the swayness, because they are holding the attributes, makes this image very striking, very lively, and I imagined that they would, have captured the attention of the worshippers at times. Whilst this similar image, a deity that holding an attribute from early Central Java period, does not show the liveliness styles compared to the ones from Nganjuk. Earlier, I mentioned that Kroms, as early as the 1913s, mentions that these groups would have formed a mandala, although he was not succeeded in deciding what type of mandala at the times, but his analysis was actually true. But what is actually a mandala? So mandala is a circles, a microcosmic diagram of cycles of esoteric deities used for ritual purposes in esoteric Buddhism and depicted in art. So oftentimes mandala is represented in terms of paintings on the golden cloth. For example, here the piece from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sometimes they would also be painted on the walls of the temples, and in some places in Tibet, the deity would have been made of the clay sculptures. So Mathilde earlier mentioned that the figurines of Nganjuk, which represent mandala, is something unique, and I think so far this is the only groups of bronzes that represent mandala. So while Krom has not been able to identify the specific type of mandala, it was Lim in 1968 who managed to decipher the specific type of mandala represented in the Nganjuk figurines. By observing the main image of Mahavarojana, Lim concluded that the mandala represented in these groups is the Vajradhatu mandala by the Anandagarbha, the Indian scholar who thought to live on the first half of the 9th century, which corresponds to the dates that we were talking earlier. And in fact, the Vajradhatu mandala of the Anandagarbha is also found in several places in Alchi and also Tabu in Tibet. That sort of allude that Java was in contact with other regions, and Java was actively involved in the Buddhist practice, sort of in international realm. And it's also supported by the fact that there is one figurine who were discovered in the Cirebon shipwreck that Mathilde also mentioned earlier. These figurines, the Vajraraga, so she would have holds the arrow and also the bow as an archer. She would have been one of the deities in the Vajradu Mandala. However, there are still some questions left unanswered, and I think this is for all of you who are interested to study more of these bronzes. We have two sculptures of the Axopia. Then it gives us poses questions whether obviously there are more than just one mandala represented in Nganjuk, but one needs to find out what is the other mandala represented. Is it the same type of the Vajratu mandala, or is it other type of the mandala? And in fact, if we try to go into the details of the objects from the Nganjuk, we would probably dealings with at least 3 mandala here. So the figure of the Vajrankusa, so called the Ankusa, at least there are three of them were discovered in the Nganjuk bronzes. Also, I forgot to mention that the 13 figurines from Nganjuk were destroyed by fire during the colonial exhibitions in Paris in 1931. So it's sort of impossible to put the whole image 100% together, but at least there should be more research to giving the identifications of each of the objects, and then also to decide what type of the mandala represented. To conclude the talks, Mathilde, and also my part, so bronze and alloy of copper and tin was used to make large and small religious statues in multiple regions of Southeast Asia. These bronze statues are important in understanding the cultural and religious history of the regions. More research is needed on trans-regional exchanges of styles, iconography, and fabrication techniques to understand the participations of the region in long-distance networks and local developments. The Nganjuk bronzes is regarded as the pinnacle of the late bronze production on Javanese period. The Nganjuk bronzes also testify that Java was in touch with other regions and also actively participated in the international Buddhist networks. I think that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mathilde and Eko, for such a clear and such rich double presentation. Thank you very, very much. So without waiting further, because time is short, time allotted for the second part of the seminar is short. It is dedicated to ceramics in Southeast Asia, and it will be presented by Dr. Heidi Tan. Allow me to give a very brief presentation. Heidi is a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of History of Art at SOAS London, where she also gives lectures. She's a founding curator of the ACM, at the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore, where she curated permanent galleries and special exhibitions and developed the Southeast Asian collections, including, of course, ceramics. So she was an Alpha Wood Foundation scholar at the SOAS University, where she recently completed her thesis on pagoda museums in Myanmar. Just a little, before giving the floor to Heidi, please use I forgot to mention, please use the Q&A option to post your questions and indicate your name and affiliations if you may. So don't use the chat, but the Q&A. Heidi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Very well. Very clear.
Thank you so much, Helene, for that introduction. Thank you for including this topic today. It's a topic that I returned to after quite some time away from the museum and away from the ceramics collection at the ACM in Singapore. And I very much enjoyed reconnecting the last couple of weeks with the literature and some of the newer research in this area. So my main challenge today really is to cover this extremely broad topic in this space allowed to me, 30 minutes, a topic which has been researched intensely by archaeologists and anthropologists, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years. I encourage those here today who conduct primary research in this field to weigh in during the discussion using the Q&A field on Zoom so that we can save this afterwards as a reference and a resource. My intention is to provide a way into the topic by looking broadly at the material qualities of ceramics. And I realize that I need to share my screen. And looking broadly at the material qualities of ceramics to appreciate the means by which Southeast Asian potters worked with clay and its transformation through fire. These original aims are a little ambitious. Here I've listed a few aims. And as such, I'll focus mainly on the development of earthenware and stoneware traditions in this region, starting in the first millennium. These images here remind us of how highly ceramics have been valued over long periods of time. Depictions of ceramics, such as this chum carved relief of a jar with high shoulders and raised foot, have been associated with ritual pouring vessels, such as the Indian Purnagata, or vase of plenty of the early centuries of the Common Era. And treasured heirloom jars that were later collected and depicted in wood by neighboring highland communities in central Vietnam, as you see the picture on the right there, demonstrate the ritual significance of ceramic vessels across different contexts, from coastal traders to agriculturalists in the hinterlands. I will end with observations from my own and others' fieldwork on the significance given to ceramics in sacred contexts, in particular in Buddhist temples in mainland Southeast Asia. So a quick look here at ceramics. What is it? Essentially, it's clay that's been transformed into a hard and durable substance that is ubiquitous throughout Southeast Asia. And we can see here that ceramics is actually a mixture of many kinds of minerals, and it has a crystalline structure which gives it something called plasticity, so that it can be easily shaped, mixed with water, and then fired to remove the water in order to fuse the body. And the advice that's often given is to think about, if you've ever tried baking bread, working dough and making bread, transforming dough into bread. There are three kinds of clay bodies, and the two that we're most concerned with here in Southeast Asia are the earthenwares, which are low-fired ceramics, fired to approximately 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. They tend to be fairly soft and porous and have red or white tones. And then there are the high-fired stonewares, which are fired up to around 1,200 or so degrees Celsius, and have very hard and non-porous quality. And these are usually pale grey, cream, or even moving towards being very pale grey, almost white in some cases. And porcelain is this high-fired, high silica body that we find in China, fired up to 1350 degrees Celsius, translucent and white. We don't have that kind of material in Southeast Asia. Interesting to look at something like the stone reliefs at Borobudur in central Java, where we see also depictions of vessel forms there. And I wonder what these vessels in this picture were made of. We can't always assume that they are made of ceramic, because vessels could also be made out of carved wood, and they could be metal at this early time. So yes, a quick look at kilns and firing methods in Southeast Asia. In the main, on the whole, the kind of kilns that we see being used in ancient times were these cross-draft kilns. And very often they're built on, say, river embankments, so that they have a sloping base. And the magic of these kilns really is that you can have your source of heat at the base, and heat rises. So naturally the heat rises up, is drawn up through the body of the kiln and out through a vent, a chimney. And these kilns can also have air vents along the sides and stoke holes so that the heat can be controlled more evenly throughout the kiln. There are sort of Chinese origins as well for these sorts of kilns, coming from the idea of an updraft kiln that also built into a bank, where the pots are stacked further up from the heat source. And of course these dragon kilns, which are long sloping climbing kilns. You can see the air vents along there. And so kind of similar to what we see in Southeast Asia, perhaps a little bit bigger. I think we have no, I don't have a picture of that yet. Okay, so moving on, just looking also at how prevalent still some of the most basic kind of firing techniques are in Southeast Asia today. Pots are still made in many places using these ground firing techniques, a bonfire essentially, where wood and fuel is built up underneath the pots, and the pots are stacked on top. And that is why sometimes you see pots, you see the variation in the firing effects on the pots. You can see these charred areas on the surface of the pots. These are very, very common pots. You see them throughout Myanmar particularly, but many other parts of Southeast Asia too, and typically used to hold water and rice, and to make offerings as well. Yes, here we are. Here's some examples recently taken out in order to make offerings in Bagan at a temple in September this year. And interesting that you can see some of these shiny ones. These pots are made in lacquer. They're made also in metal, and they're made in ceramics. And here you can see some of those earthenware firing effects. Of course, these days people really want to use the lacquer ones because they're more lightweight, they're more durable, they're easier to clean, and they don't break easily. And these are some of the hand-built earthenware pots that you see containing water in Myanmar, and they've been constructed usually by women on the ground, seated on the ground, as they have done for centuries, paddle beating, coiling and paddle beating the pots. And we can see that this was a technique that was around in the 11th century, depicted on a glazed tile at Bagan. These are some photos that I just found recently and thought I would share. They were taken at the last surviving dragon kiln in Singapore in the mid-80s. And they show how the family who set up this kiln in the early 20th century have continued to use some of the techniques from southern China. They fire in a long dragon kiln, but they also throw on a wheel. And here I think this is a kick wheel. And they throw clay down and center clay first on the wheel to create the base, which gets built up, pulled up through the wheel, the motion of the wheel, and then further added to these coils of clay. So it's a mixture of kick wheel turned pot plus coils, and then hand finishing. And these are what the pots look like. This was a unique pottery in Singapore. They were using local clays, which they refined themselves, and they were making their own ash glazes from local substances, and their own sort of repertoire of colours, glaze colours. And sadly, the kiln had to close down to make way for urban development. Kiln supports and firing accidents. Oh yes, these are really helpful, these photographs, to show you what happens if you get pots slumping in a kiln, either because they've melted because the temperature's gone too high, or the supports are insufficient and they've collapsed in on themselves. And many of these so-called Sawangklop wares from North Central Thailand, made between the 14th and 16th centuries, have got, bear the marks of the supports that we use to fire them. These round rings at the bottom here, for example, are quite typical of these wares. this just gives you an idea of how pots were stacked up using these supports and little setters, which also left their marks on the insides of bowls. And this is a very useful map here that Dr. Go has produced, showing major kiln sites in mainland Southeast Asia. So some of these I'll be mentioning are here in north central Thailand, so Twante, Lagumbi, Bago, Bagan, and also, yeah, some of these northern kilns in Vietnam as well. I'll talk a bit more about these Khmer high-fired stonewares in a moment, but just to say that recent excavations in the Kulin Mountains have produced these wonderful lumps of clay that have been formed to make supports for the wares in the firing, and we'll see why in a minute that these lumps of clay were so necessary. This is my attempt to try to contain this little talk using John Micksick's wonderful timeline map and adding to it some of my own images of some of the pieces that I'll mention today. We don't unfortunately have time to go into the hundreds of shipwreck cargoes of ceramics brought in from China and from West Asia and other places, which of course interacted with the ceramics of Southeast Asia. We're sticking mostly here in this upper section to what was produced in Southeast Asia, but use this as your sort of basic touch point to look back at the kinds of developments that happened in the region, significant developments, significant innovations like these early earthenwares and these high-fired glazed stonewares later on after the turn of the first millennium, and these earliest blue and white wares, made in Vietnam, the only place that could actually fire underglazed cobalt blue decorated wares. So I start with some of the innovative earthenwares that these are shards that I thank John Micksick for calling my attention to early on in my career at the ACM in Singapore. These were shards that were retrieved from a boat in the Pontian River in Malaysia. And we think they're about the 3rd to 5th century. They were made sometime between the 3rd to 5th century. The boat itself was C14 tested more recently to, the timbers were tested to the 3rd to 5th centuries, but more recently to the 2nd century Common Era. And what's interesting about these shards is that if you go to Ok Yao, the site of Ok Yao in the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam, we find very similar shards with similar interlocking semicircle patterns, combed patterns. If you can imagine you're holding in your hand as a potter a tool with teeth, and the action that you have to make of your wrist in order to make these semicircular bands, or these combing, these angular comb patterns as well, with something with a much finer tooth. There's also bands of just concentric lines around the shoulder of these, what would have been quite large pots. Someone has really taken the trouble to use a white slip and then put an iron red wash over the outside of these pots. And when you look at the cross section, you can see also that there are some inclusions there. Some organic matter has been used as a kind of temper to make the clay less sticky, so that a pot could be constructed on such a scale. This is an unusually fine paste shard from Kenjiang Museum, which I suggested back in 2003, perhaps had sprig molded, sort of separately molded and applied figurative motifs. But I'm looking again at this piece now and I'm seeing these impressions around the edges, and I'm also wondering whether, in fact, some of these raised dots, for example, might not be the result of stamping a stamp into very soft clay rather than applying these small motifs. Some other extremely fine earthenwares from the early centuries of the Roman era are these Dwaravati sculptures and reliefs. John Guy notes, for example, in this piece on the right, the flex of the body, this Tribhanga posture here, the treatment of the hair, and you can see some very fine cross-hatching on the hair there to suggest the hair was braided, tied in braids, and ornaments like this belt, for example, and sash, are typical of this period, and that potters must have been aware of Northern Indian traditions at that time. The enthroned Buddha here from the site of Kubwa, where a mound revealed many pieces, was thought to have been part of the decoration of the base of a stupa. The seated Buddha with the legs pendant was probably based on Indian models from Ajanta and other cave sites in Western India of the 5th to 7th centuries. So these are very fine pieces, and looking at actually at Mathilde's slides just now of the lost wax casting process, I also have a question for her about whether or not the original models for some of the lost wax, the original wax figures might not have been made in clay at some point, and then perhaps, you know, this is just a wild thought that some of these fine early earthenwares could have provided such models. Clay, at least, was probably used. Fine clay was probably used to create the molds, I would think, around some of those wax models. And then, of course, there are these wonderful pew-fired earthenware ritual objects from Sri Kshetra in Myanmar, 6th to 8th century, roughly. This was one of the earliest sites of pew culture, urbanization and Buddhism. And Sri Kshetra was a royal centre in Upper Myanmar that has yielded large quantities of earthenware, including brickwork foundations, distinctive burial urns, clay tablets, such as the piece in the centre here, and finally modelled architectural reliefs, such as the piece here on the right. These tablets or clay ceilings, this is one of the earliest and largest in Southeast Asia. Clay ceilings, or votive tablets as they are often called, were made by stamping wet clay with a metal or ceramic mould. The process of stamping is understood to be an act of merit making. I quite like this piece as well, because if you notice at the sides, there seem to be two little vases here at the side, possibly. Anyway, and this relief panel here with wonderful expressions on these faces, modelled, hand modelled, and incised. Yeah, there's a lot of incising there. A very smooth finish. Depicts one of the Jataka stories, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives. And it too was probably a panel for the base of a stupa, which would have provided instructions for devotees as they circumambulated around the stupa. Okay, so we move now into innovative glazed stonewares. And here we see on the top left, this group here in particular, is the stonewares from Phnom Rek in the Kulen Mountains in Cambodia. These are wheel-thrown and hand-finished jars and bottles, covered jars. And one of the interesting details of the production of these jars is that these turned covers, each cover is made individually to fit its body. And these were fired in cross-draft kilns, which were used from around the early 11th century over a period of about 50 years. And as we saw earlier on, there were also these unique supports that were positioned underneath these pieces and around these pieces in order to accommodate them during firing on a sloping floor of the kiln. Interestingly also is that smaller wares were often stacked inside larger wares inside the kiln. And I'm wondering if perhaps an advantage of this is that, well, it made firing more efficient. You could fire more wares at one time and increase production, but also these larger wares would have provided protection against kiln ash, grit, and other debris flying through the kiln during a firing. The advantage of high-fired glazed wares is their durability and their impermeable quality. And these wares would have required a significant investment of time and labor to make unique forms, such as this reliquary, for example, from kilns in the north of Thailand, north of Sukhothai and Sisachanalai, for example. Sukhothai and Sisachanalai, of course, these are where these high-fired architectural ceramics were produced in the 15th century. This is a wonderful ridge tile that came to Singapore for the exhibition that we had in 2012. These large jars in Vietnam were decorated with a unique combination of techniques, including carved and incised decoration known as sgraffito, and underglaze iron brown painted designs. The ritual warfare depicted on this jar includes very fine incised tattoos on the legs of this warrior. I don't know if you can see it, thought to represent dragons with protective powers. The moving on, yes, these examples here of Sawangkalok bowls are typical of the types that were found in burials at the border between Myanmar and Thailand. These were highly revered wares, and they're decorated here with lotus motifs, common Buddhist symbol. However, large quantities of wares with a variety of designs were produced at these twin walled cities of Sawangkalok and Sukhothai and exported widely within the region and beyond, particularly to Indonesia and the Philippines. Wares have also been found in Japan. This period of the mid 14th to 16th centuries saw a ban in China on ceramic exports, and hence the Thai and Vietnamese kilns stepped in to meet demand. These glazed stoneware pieces are from Twante kilns, or thought to be from Twante kilns. Iron brown and celadon wares may have been made in Twante in the Delta region of Yangon. Hundreds of kilns have been found there in the 1990s, although many were disturbed and cannot now easily be identified in relation to ceramic finds. I particularly like this piece that was found on the Santa Cruz shipwreck in the Philippines, very unusual. And Vietnamese blue and white are also unique to Southeast Asia, unique to Vietnam. Northern Vietnamese kilns were the only ones in Southeast Asia to produce high-fired stonewares with underglazed cobalt blue decoration. And although the origins of the cobalt remain unclear, it's thought that the technology developed naturally from the use of iron brown, and with some influence perhaps from Guangdong kilns in southern China. The tile fragments are reportedly from the Majapahit capital at Traulan, are just some of the many blue and white and also enameled tiles that can be found at sacred sites in Java. At the mosques, for example, in Demak and Kudus, intact tiles can be found on minarets, walls, and gateways. Oh, and I should also mention this, an amazing beetle sire set from South Sulawesi in the ASEAN's collection, made out of shards of Vietnamese blue and white, but very carefully selected shards, because the piece has a very striking sort of octagonal form. This would have been a very important heirloom piece. And I have to move swiftly on because I realize I'm not going to make most of my examples here in the next, I think, 5 minutes. So I will just say briefly that these glazed earthenware is another significant technological development which we see taking place in Myanmar in particular. Green and white wares found again at the Tak Omkhoi border region in burials. in the mid-80s when road building took place, which may have been made at Twante and Lagunbi kilns. The advantage of putting lead in glazes is that lead acts as a flux and it brings the melting temperature of the glaze down. And so therefore an earthenware body can be glazed. These wares use, these kinds of glazed wares use tin to produce the white and copper for the green painted decoration. Particularly like this stupa in Bagan called Sintseri, or the glazed stupa, which is mentioned in an inscription of 1194 CE on the wall of its neighboring temple, the Alodo Pagoda. It's one of 22 sites of the 10th to 13th centuries that began to have glazed decoration. And in Merabu, yes, my colleague Sortun Lin recently published this paper, and I thank him for permission to use this image. In Merabu, in Rakhine State, glazed technology, perhaps influenced by technology coming from Islamic India or Bengal, used this very noticeable dark blue cobalt blue found nowhere else in Myanmar, possibly also sourced from India. Don Hine identified 7 production sites where in-ground cross-draft kilns were situated in Merabu, although these have yet to be excavated. The use of cut tiles to form mosaics on the floors and walls may have been inspired by earlier lead glazed tile work at Bagan of the 11th century. However, a wider range of colours was used at Merabu, and the tiles were arranged in a jigsaw fashion so that they fit together like this, rather than embedded in stucco. And it's just interesting to see that much later on, we can see that the pitting here, these are earthenware tiles, probably also lead glazed in Shan State at this late 19th century monastery. The creative reuse of ceramics is something also very interesting to think about in Southeast Asia. This colonial style building with pigment painted plasterwork must have been a striking addition to the Ananda temple in Bagan. According to Umyo Nyun Aung, 24 clay tablets, which we see embedded here in the walls of this prayer hall, were a donation to the temple in the early 20th century when the hall was built. The tablets are of the Bagan period, so 11th to 13th century, and must have been fairly high-fired because they've survived all this time outside and a lot of weathering. You can see some damage here where the edge of this tile is quite badly damaged and has a rather dark grey body, which is interesting. In this case, the tablets are deeply impressed into clay that must be quite fine, as well as the iconographic details are really quite visible. The Buddha is seated with his right hand in the earth calling gesture, and there are several lines of verse below the throne, and a line of beads can be seen if you're able to zoom in on this picture around the edge of the tablet, which is typical of iconographic details of that time. Similar tablets are found at the Shwedagon Pagoda Museum, as we can see on the left here, where we can see evidence of gilding, which is quite common. And then there are other meritorious kinds of porcelain donations also in Thailand. Upsit Sukam has reported on a range of imported ceramics found inside stupas and adorning the walls of temples in Thailand. 2 examples in southern Thailand at Nakhon Si Thammarat and inland from there both have Chinese blue and white, as well as enameled dishes dating from the late Ming to early Qing period or late Ayutthaya period, the early 17th to mid 18th century. The style of stucco work at the Sinkhorn temple, he suggests, indicate that this is when the dishes were installed. The practice continued into the 19th and early 20th centuries when Chinese, Japanese and European wares donated to the temple were that's my alarm, when Japanese, European and Chinese wares were donated to the temple and installed as decorative features. And this is just an example of a Zhangzhou dish in one of the monastery museums that I visited in Rawu. Unusual to see this in Myanmar. Typically, we tend to think of these large dishes as being collected by communities living in the outer islands of Indonesia, for example. And I'm just going to move on very quickly to conclude. That pagoda museums often have older ceramics, as we saw in the last slide. Here you can see lead glazed earthenwares from Mount U, and at the Shwedagon Pagoda Museum, the colonial period ceramics of the late 19th, early 20th century includes wares like this bowl, perhaps made by the Scottish company J and MP Beld, with a design very similar to one they call Pegu. These were transfer printed designs popular in Southeast Asia at this time, which made many references to places and flora and fauna of the region. I shall move on to say that we should end really with a question. How do these traditions of keeping and displaying ancient objects impact on our understanding of ceramics in Southeast Asia? I think this is a good place to end. As we have seen, ceramic provides the most durable medium for undertaking life's most basic needs, as well as celebrating by displaying its more treasured moments, such as life cycle rituals and Buddhist merit making. The interment of relics in a ceramic container or the installation of dishes on a temple wall invests these ceramic objects with sacred value. As one temple trustee reiterated to me some years ago, at the pagoda, everything becomes the Buddha's belongings, and this is the reason that he not only had a duty of care, but also an obligation to keep things clean and shiny. In relation to ceramics and the sacred, Stanley O'Connor wrote in 1983 of heirloom jars and other ceramics as having an aura and a radiance that shines through, and that this defines, quote, the quality of a thing experienced as sacred, unquote. His work seems to resonate with what the trustee was trying to convey to me. As the legacy of an act of merit making, such objects gifted to the pagoda or Buddha remain active as they are viewed repeatedly by others who also gain merit from seeing them and feel inspired to donate, thus perpetuating the ritual through which they seek to ensure a good rebirth. O'Connor's conclusion might aptly apply in this case too, that ceramics played a role as a surrogate body for the spirit, and perhaps the very processes by which clay was transformed through fire into a new order of being became an analogy for processes of spiritual transformation. And that is where I shall end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and the two of you for such clear, richly documented and illustrated presentations. They really clear, all of the three of you showed the importance of Southeast Asian agency and the specificity of Southeast Asian artistic and technical skills. So thank you for the really rich images that you showed, and thanks also for sharing your personal research. This is, I think, what makes this series so special, is that part of the presentations are sharing very up-to-date research on each of your domain. So I think we have 8 questions, which we should probably have enough time to answer if the answers are short enough. So allow me to start with Heidi. Would you like to start with Leslie Poulin's question on, since you're still warm, were Vietnamese ceramics only found in the mosque at Kudus, and from where do the ceramics seen in the outside wall of the Kraton Kasepuan at Cirebon originate? So where do the ceramics seen in the outside wall of Kraton Kasepuan at Cirebon originate? Do you have an answer to that?
That's a lovely question, but I think some of you who have more experience in Indonesia would have visited that site and would have a better idea. As far as I know of the Vietnamese tiles, but I do not know of the complete repertoire of the different kinds of ceramics that were placed at those sites.
Okay, so another one for Heidi. Why was Vietnam the only place in Southeast Asia that could fire underglazed cobalt wares? Was it because they had the silica content in the clay to produce the whites? From Natalie Pearson. Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah, how do you get a high enough fired body and then a pale enough glaze to be able to show off that blue. We still don't really know how the cobalt oxide, where it was imported from, how it actually came into kiln sites in northern Vietnam. It's a very intriguing and frustrating question because we haven't really been able to find the answers as far as I know. But yes, because they were the body of those stonewares, we still call them stonewares. We don't call them porcelain. They're not considered true porcelain, but the body is a very pale grey. And so when you apply glaze, you can actually get this very pale brown in order to show off the blue. But how that came together, we still don't know.
Thanks, Heidi. So there's a question about bronzes from Leslie Pullen again. Why do you think the Javanese bronzes are so much smaller compared to mainland Southeast Asia? Probably Echo would like to answer.
That's I don't know. So this Nganjuk bronzes is really showing new trends, sort of not just only their stylistic features, their religious representations, but also in terms of the size, they're very small. But yeah, I don't know the exact reasons why they made so small. Because probably the dating for the mandala is always consists of dozens of figurines, so that perhaps making smaller images would be more practical to be carried away from one place to another. But yeah, maybe Mathilde can add more on that.
Mathilde, would you like to chip in, or there's another question about Kala image?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, I just want to add that I mean, there are also many small bronzes found in Cambodia. So when I showed an example of a very large image, but there are also many small images. So everywhere in Southeast Asia, large bronze images and small bronze images were made.
Thank you, Mathilde. Sorry about that. So Kala image seems to be similar to Taosi of Chinese bronze 3,000 years ago. Do you think there's any relationship between them?
Well, I don't know the direct relationships, but it seems to me that the sort of the demonic face, demonic creatures is very common in other traditions. But also I think the drums, which also found across Southeast Asia, and also I think in China, that's also proof that perhaps, I don't know, there is some relations in terms of art. Again, Mathilde would probably help me in answering this.
No, I think the Kala motif, I mean, these demonic figures are quite common all over Asia. So it's difficult to know if there's a specific relationship. It's a common theme. So to know if there's a relationship, I think we have to analyze the stylistic features, maybe to see more connections. But it's difficult to tell.
A question for Heidi from Hugh Pinko. I'm curious if there are any similarities in the technique used and raw materials to produce the blue and white stoneware dish from the Belitung shipwreck and the Vietnamese blue and white items.
Oh gosh, I really don't know. They're so far apart in time as well. Belitung shipwreck is early to mid 9th century. And the Vietnamese blue and white is so much later. Yeah, I'm not really sure how they compare.
Okay, so I'm trying to keep track of the questions. So Echo, why do you think bronze casting ceased after this period and that only this group has been found? Who was it made for? Yeah,
so actually, I should have mentioned earlier that this group of bronzes is not the only group of bronzes I've discovered. There are other two group of bronzes, namely the Surocolo discovered in Yogyakarta, and there is another one, Kuti from Ponorogo, which also represents mandala. Why did they cease? But obviously they are not totally stopped, because, for example, in the Singosari period in the 13th century, the Amukapasa sculptures were still produced, and then for the secular objects like the dated mirrors with the Kediri, very specific type of quadrat aksaras were also produced. But the reasons why that the production was disgracing, I have no clue. I have no clue why they disgrace. Perhaps the movements of just wild thought, wild theory that the movement of the kingdoms from Central to East Java would sort of also brought along the idea of the selections, productions of the art. So instead, for example, they instead of choosing to produce the bronze figurines, they would perhaps making stone sculptures, for example. Yeah, that's all I can say.
Mathilde, would you like to chip in or for another question?
No, I think there's more research needed on the whole production of Javanese bronzes to know exactly when it started, when it stopped, and what were the trends. But if there are changes, they are most likely linked to ritual changes. So.
Okay. Well, since you're there with your mic on, about your slide on archaeometallurgy, you mentioned petrography as a technique used in the study of bronze statues. Could you please elaborate on that from Alvin from NTU?
Yeah, thank you for asking the question because I did not have time to explain all the techniques, so it's great that you ask. So petrography is a technique used to, so when a bronze image has a clay core inside, and if we can access this clay core, then we can sample it and then compare these samples of clay core from surface, and based on the composition of the clay core, then we can identify bronzes that were made in the same workshop when the composition is similar. But it does not always enable us to trace where the images were made, unless maybe we can sample the clay that would have been used in a workshop.
Do we know why Javanese bronze came to an end in the 10th century or 11th century suddenly? Echo, Mathilde.
These sort of the same questions that the Ibu Leslie asked, but yeah, they do not end abruptly. I mean, the production was still ongoing. I mean, in the semester period I mentioned earlier, the sculptures of the Amuka Pasha were still being made, and then during the Kediri period, the 11th century, we still see also, although not the of the religious figurines, the religious image, but we see also the productions of the mirror, the dated handles made of the bronze, and also I think the religious utensils also I think were still produced, but yeah.
Since you're there, Echo, do we know if the Nganjuk bronzes contain consecration deposits? I don't know if you answered that already.
Not yet. Well, in fact, so during my master research at SOAS back in 2017, I was not able to come back to Indonesia to see the biggest groups in Jakarta in person. Instead, I traveled to the Netherlands to see the two objects, and I am not aware that there would have probably, as Mathilde already explained earlier, that the objects would have been inserted with the Ye Dharma mantra, for example, to make it sacred. But I don't know, Mathilde, have you?
I have not examined all the Nganjuk bronzes. I have examined some pieces that are in a related style that are kept at the Musée Guimet in Paris. And so the photo, the neutron tomography showing the content of the consecration deposit. So it's in this Nganjuk style, and so it contains the consecration deposit. But I don't know if the group of bronzes found in Nganjuk, if they all contain consecration deposits, because I have not seen them. So.
Since we have 1 minute left, I would love to hear Heidi a tiny little bit more on this idea of aura and radiance, you know, of ceramics that that the caretakers had to take care of, about, you know, the sacred values of object, and this duty of care, the notion of shininess of the ceramics. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
He wasn't referencing ceramics per se. He was actually, I think, also talking. We were talking about gilding, and re-gilding old Buddha images, and how it was important that in many places Buddha images are washed, are re-gilded, and it's part of the renovation cycle, if you like, of the whole pagoda and its contents. So this idea that things must be kept clean and shiny they're living objects. And I was thinking about shiny white porcelain with enamels on, colors, you know, blue and white from China, like those krak dishes that were on the Wat Sing Kon in southern Thailand. When they arrived in the region, you know, they would have been seen as almost magical in a sense, a material that had otherworldly kinds of properties, and sitting high up on the walls of temples, you know, in the 18th century, they would have created a lot of color and vibrancy. So yeah, refreshed, you know, the exteriors of temples. They were also put into stupas, in small blue and white Vietnamese and Thai brown glazewares, and even some Cham ceramics have been found in stupas as deposits in Thailand. So not just what happens on the outside of the walls, but also investing internally, you know, in reliquaries and deposits, using durable, shiny, colorful, you know.
That's a very important aspect of the use of objects, right, and their appreciation, which we know so little about for these early periods. I'd like to thank the three of you very, very warmly. Thank you for also accepting to, you know, stick to the short time allotted. This is a very difficult exercise for researchers that the three of you are, especially. And so time is up. I'd like to thank also all participants for the challenging, interesting questions. Leslie, I will probably send you a few references about Kudus and other early Islamic site ceramics. Thank you, and please join us for our next talk. And I don't know if Noel would like to say something. I think we have to end here. And so thank you again very, very much. Have a good day in London. Heidi, have a good day in Malang, Echo, if you're in Malang, and Mathilde in Singapore.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.
Thank you.